Thanks so much for your patience. I think we're ready to get started. And thanks to the folks joining online as well for your patience. Welcome to our research fellow talks. My name is Venkat. I'm part of the team here at the Archives at NCBS, which is a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India. Do join us to visit the archive if you've not been there before. And do keep a lookout for calls for the research fellowship program. The last call just ended this a few days ago, and we've had a really good response. And I think to credit to all the research fellows who've done such good work and shared their work in the public. The research fellow program has been made possible through a generous support from the TNQ Foundation. So thanks so much to the TNQ Foundation for the support, not just for this fellowship, but for the work of the archives. I won't take too much of your time, especially given the delay, but I would love to introduce Karthik, whose work has been really lovely to see and explore and see how he sort of looked at these intersections. And today his work is going to be looking at the evolution of Lal Bagh, drawing insights from the archives at NCBS. Karthik was a biologist in his former life, as he says, specializing in animal behavior and evolutionary biology. He got his undergrad degree from St. Joseph's right here in the city and master's from Pondicherry University. After a stint as a project associate at the Center for Ecological Sciences at IISc, where he studied social behavior in ants, he went on to obtain his PhD from the University of Missouri, Columbia in the United States, for which he was investigating the role of vibrational signals in mediating sociality in a group of insects called treehoppers. He then taught biology at Augustana College, which is a liberal arts and science college in Illinois in the United States, for a few years before he moved back to Bangalore to IISc, where he worked as a science communicator and educator until last year. He is now a freelancer and a research fellow at the National Center for Biological Sciences here in Bangalore. Karthik, thanks so much for your work, and over to you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Very good afternoon to everyone. So a few months ago, my former colleague at ISC, Deepika, who now works at the archives here, got in touch with me and told me about this fellowship program. And I had been doing some freelance work, and she asked me if I'd be interested in applying. And I said, sure, why not? And she also told me, these are not her words, these are my words, that the director, Shashidhara, has been thinking about this ambitious project. So as soon as I joined, I got to meet with Shashi, who has been thinking about establishing a museum of science history of Bangalore and Mysore as well in the digital space. And this was something that he's been thinking about and also been talking about it with Sadhana, who's here today. Sadhana? And Sadhana is the former director of the Vishweshwaraya Industrial and Technological Museum. And so we had to make a start somewhere. So what we did was they had already been thinking about a bunch of things. I'll begin with acknowledgements for this broader section that I'm going to talk about first, and then I'll talk about Lal Bagh. So we've been thinking about a few issues related to such a huge undertaking. First is the rationale itself. What exactly do we aim to achieve, and what are the more specific objectives, who our audience might be? The nature of this museum, some people have told me that maybe museum is not the appropriate word for what we're trying to do. Maybe a gallery is a better word. And those are, and also been thinking about whether it should be but for the sake of this talk, I'll refer to it as a museum. And we've also been thinking about whether it should be a public museum or a private museum or a combination of both. Whether it should be even when you think about digital museum, there are several physical museums which have digital artifacts, right? And you could create a museum based on those alone, or whether you want to have a sort of a virtual museum. So those are sort of things that we've been thinking about, as well as the format of how we're going to do it, whether we do it in one installment, two installments, or several installments over a few years. Timeline, personal, budget, and so on. The goal for us for the past few months and the next few months has been to try to raise money for this project, which we hope to do once we get to a certain point. One of the first things that we did, Sadhana, I, and also Kanika, who's a scholar in residence, I believe she may have left, is we paid a quick visit to Mysore, just as an exploratory visit, and also Srirangapatna, and started thinking about some of the things that we could potentially do. And I got interested, for whatever reason, in these rockets that Tipu had developed called Tipu's rockets, so the Mysorean rockets. And these rockets they did have a sort of a technological breakthrough at some point in medieval Deccan. And for the first time, you actually saw the use of metal as a casket that would hold gunpowder. And this was something that I'd been working on for a few months. I was hoping to talk about this, but at some point in June, I had a discussion with Venkat, and Venkat told me that, for this particular presentation and for this particular fellowship, I should think about using some material from the NCBS archive itself, which I hadn't done for the rocket project. So one of the things that we'd been thinking about, but in the meanwhile, Shashi also said that maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on each of these projects. Maybe we should just identify certain things that would grab the attention of Bangaloreans and other people who are interested in the history of science of Bangalore, identify certain stories, and just hit the ground running to start doing your research. So what Sadhana and I, decided to do was, we identified certain themes that we thought would be exciting for people, both Bangaloreans as well as others, that we could make a start with. And one of those was, of course, Mysorean rockets, and Sadhana has been working on the history of electrification of Bangalore. And one of the other things that I had been interested was the history of Lal Bagh. So I knew almost nothing about Lal Bagh, even though I was born and raised in Bangalore. I am from the northern part of the city. So going to Lal Bagh was not something that we did very often. Maybe during when we got a day off, either Independence Day or Republic Day, when they had a flower show, or when you had people coming from outside, and then you're left wondering as to where to take them in Bangalore. So that's when you typically go to Lal Bagh. Kaban Park was a closer destination and a more favored destination for many of us. But when we did go to Lal Bagh, we really never thought about the history of the Lal Bagh. We'd either enter through the main gate, go to the glass house and all of that, and then go to the rock. There used to be a deer park as well into the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, and then eat Joy ice cream and then come back. Or we go from this end and then end up in the main gate and go to MTR for a rava idli and a coffee or a fruit salad with ice cream. So Lal Bagh was something that I'd been thinking about, partly because I'd also had a chance to talk about it with Vijay Thiruvadi, and one of who knew Bangalore, unfortunately he's no more, who knew Lal Bagh more intimately than most other people. And Vijay, I also happened to go for one of his heritage walks within Lal Bagh, and it was quite nice. And since then, I'd been thinking about Lal Bagh a little bit more than I did earlier. So in any case, but I was still thinking about doing this Mysorean rockets, and Venkat suggested that maybe I should think of using some material from the archives, as I already mentioned. And there was some material already about Lal Bagh, and I thought I could use that as a segue to talk about the rocket story. And then I had another discussion with him in early July, and he asked me, so what's the connection between the Lal Bagh story and the Mysorean rockets? Other than Tipu Sultan, there was really I didn't have an answer for him, right? There was no organic connection between the two. And so he suggested that maybe it would be interesting for me to think about Lal Bagh itself, which is what I ended up doing. So this is the Mysorean rocket. So that's what I'm going to talk about. The Evolution of Lal Bagh. I have changed the subtitle just a little bit, and hopefully it'll become clear as to why I did that. So I have several people to thank for this particular project. Venkat, of course. Ravi, who's helped take photographs of some of the material that I will show you on a Friday evening. Thank you, Ravi. Anjali, who's shared material that is still being processed and brought it up and taken it back down, taken it back to where it belongs on several consecutive days. I also had a chance to meet this Bangalorean, Bangalorean who's passionate about the history of the city, called Chandan. And Chandan has a bit of, he's an amateur historian who has some expertise in the military history of Bangalore. And he very kindly took about half a day off and showed me around Lal Bagh. Shyamal, who some of you know, who's an independent researcher, shared a couple of resources with me. And he also put me in touch with a former curator called Narayan Swamy, who I had a chance to speak with. Before we jump into what I'm going to actually say about Lal Bagh, I want to share with you a couple of learnings from studying these two things that I have in the last few months. The first is that we need archives to do our research, and we need to identify primary resources, even if we begin with secondary resources. But for us, I also realized that, especially when I was trying to look into the Mysorean rockets, there were several rabbit holes that I'll go down, and it took me a few months, and I realized that that was not ideal. And I also realized that when I was looking at Lal Bagh the last few weeks, I realized that the time was not sufficient for me. And both to learn about the history and also come up with a narrative structure. And so, which is why I've called it the Goldilocks time window. So we need to identify that time window. Three, I've already mentioned the role of the archives, but I think, so what Sadhana and I decided is that for every theme that we explore, there are certain things at a bare minimum that we need to do. We need to talk about the what, the when, the how, the why, and so on. And these are things that that everybody should know, and that we should know first, and that everybody should know. But we also realize that I certainly realize that each of the two stories that I worked on will require a different kind of a narrative, which is why going forward, I think it'll be important for us to involve people who come from many different backgrounds and who can think about, who have the opportunity to think about this particular exploration based on their experience and background and interest. So what I have attempted to do is, and I've realized that at least in the limited time that I had, and this is going to be a bit of a preliminary talk, and I realized that even if I cannot use the archives to offer any novel insights in terms of information, the material from the archives can certainly be used as a prism through which I can narrate the story. The other thing that it helped me do is to think about the kind of story I wanted to tell and from whose perspective. For this particular thing, it's typically the establishment perspective, but I realized that the story could be told from the perspective of many different people. And I'll talk about at least one of them. So the two collections that I have used in order as a sort of a gateway to this Lal Bagh story is a collection of Mr. T.N.A. Perumal, who used to be a wildlife photographer. He's no more. He passed away in 2017. And I believe his son, T.A. Natarajan, has shared all of his material with the archives at NCBS. It's still in the process of being processed. So I relied only on material that had already been identified and that I knew for sure as to what it was. but this is going to take some time for somebody to actually sit through the material that he has given us, especially identification of the plants and the trees. The other thing that I relied on we started late, but I'll try to wind up by 5. The other thing that I relied on are these is this 3-set volume. And this is a set of books that we have in the archives at NCBS, which I'll tell you a little bit about it before we proceed. Back in 2008, Vijay Thiruvadi, who I mentioned, who was also the trustee of the Bangalore Environment Trust, he chanced upon a set of paintings, botanical illustrations in the Lal Bagh library, or the horticultural library, which is a place that not too many people have had a chance to visit. It's not easy to get permission to use their to access their resources, but he was able to, and he found these beautiful paintings that were badly in need of restoration. And so he talked to the horticultural department, and these were beautiful botanical illustrations. I'll show you a few of them. And and by 2011 or so, they got permission to actually restore these paintings. And he brought on board Indira Chowdhury, who's with Arch, Archival Resources for Contemporary History, which is now part of the Srishti School of Design. And they worked on restoration of this material, and they also brought out a book, Bangalore Environment Trust and Arch at Srishti brought out this book called the Botanical Illustration Collection at Lal Bagh. And it has lots of beautiful illustrations, paintings mainly, watercolors. And most of them are based on plants that are in Lal Bagh. There are a few from outside Lal Bagh as well. And many of the paintings, they don't have a name for the painter, because many of these paintings were done by Indians, except one person who chose to put his name on these paintings. His name is Cheluvaiya Raju. So his paintings, you will have his name, Cheluvaiya Raju or KC Raju. And from what I gathered, Cheluvaiya Raju was from a Telugu-speaking family in Tanjavur. And this family was, I think he had a background in painting, and many of the people in his family were artists. And he was sort of brought here by a botanist called John Cameron, and I'll talk about him later on. And he was not trained in botany, and he would make illustrations for Cameron. And you can actually look at those illustrations, and if you look at those illustrations, you will be able to see pencil scribbles by John Cameron. He said, stigma not visible, and the name of the family, etc. And he was actually, you can see that it was a learning process for Cheluvaiya Raju as well. And I will show you some of that material. So the sort of broad framework that I've used is to think about Lal Bagh as constructed nature. And this is a term that I got familiar only a few weeks ago, that became familiar to me only a few weeks ago when I attended Preeta's talk. And she was talking about constructed nature, specifically in the context of museums. But constructed nature can also be thought of any kind of space, for instance, in this case, a botanical garden, whose creation and development were the result of many different kinds of motivations: religious beliefs, colonial disposition, enlightenment values, and of course, aesthetic sensibilities. And hopefully you'll get a glimpse of that in the next 20 to 30 minutes. So this is the first image that I have used. This is from, so all of Perumal's photographs are in the form of slides. And so Ravi had to take pictures of these slides. So this is an image that many of you will be familiar with. This is the Lal Bagh rock, and this is the Kempe Gowda Tower. Not quite, but nevertheless, we call it the Kempe Gowda Tower. So this rock, you may know, is among the oldest rock formations in the world, about 3 to 3.5 billion years old. And it's called the Peninsular Gneiss. I won't say too much more about it, but feel free to read about it. And this rock was not part of, it's just outside Lal Bagh. It was not part of Lal Bagh officially, I think, until after independence. And at the top of this rock is this Gopuram, or what we refer to as Kempe Gowda's towers. And I want to sort of begin with this slide for this section. So I try to take a picture which would be from an angle very similar to the angle from which this painting was made by Robert Colebrook in 1791. And you will notice that these two structures are different. He somehow managed to get on top. He managed to paint this from an angle that allows you to see not just this, but also the gardens that existed back then. This is what is known as the cypress and the rose gardens that Hyder Ali had made. But clearly, this is not what we see today. This has been taken down, and that Gopuram has been built. I am not entirely sure if this is, so many of you Bangaloreans will know that there are 4 towers, which are sometimes referred to as lookout or watchtowers in different parts of the city. And people say that either these were, as the name suggests, these were lookout towers, or these were towers that some historians have also suggested that Kempe Gowda's son, Kempe Gowda II, set up these to mark the 4 corners of what Bangalore will eventually become. Now, again, there's no evidence that this was actually one of those towers, but most people call it the Kempe Gowda's tower. The other thing that I want to talk about as far as Kempe Gowda is concerned is the origin of Lal Bagh itself. Now, Vijay Thiruvadi in his book is one of those people who argues. Now, if you know a little bit about the history of Bangalore, you will know that even though Bangalore now we know is at least 1200 years old, medieval Bangalore was the brainchild of Kempe Gowda. And he built the Pete area, and he also built a fort. And around that, there were paddy fields and gardens, etc. One other thing that he did was he either upgraded many existing temples or built new temples, like the Bull Temple and the Gavipuram Temple, etc. And Thiruvadi's argument is that in order for people to go to these temples, and in order for them to go to these temples and offer flowers to the god, they needed to have these little totas. And one of these totas is what he refers to as the Kembut tota, which he thinks is the origin, which he believes is the origin of Lal Bagh. He says the genesis of the garden can be traced back to Nadaprabhu Kempe Gowda. He visualized the development of gardens at 4 cardinal points where he erected towers. The first one was located where the present-day Lal Bagh is situated, adjacent to the Kempe Gowda Tower. Again, there is no evidence for this claim. However, given what we know about what Kempe Gowda did, it is entirely possible that, as Suresh Jairam, who's also written a book about Lal Bagh, it's much more of a personal memoir than a historical account like Thiruvadi's book. He says that these totas, kadus, and topus were the first step in Bangalore becoming a garden city. And it is here under Kempe Gowda's rule, that the seeds of Lal Bagh were sown. So it's a much more nuanced claim, unlike the claim that Thiruvadi makes, which is much more definitive about the origin of Lal Bagh itself. But most people do believe that Lal Bagh was established by Hyder Ali. And I've used the picture of a rose garden and a rose from this rose garden as an entry point to talk about this particular section. And if you go to Lal Bagh today, and if you look at old paintings from the 1790s when the British first arrived in Bangalore. They defeated Tipu Sultan in Bangalore before they defeated him in Srirangapatnam. And so when many people made paintings, they also made paintings of the positions of the different garrisons of the British Army, the East India Company Army. And there you will see that the cypress gardens of Hyder Ali, the cypress and the rose gardens of Hyder Ali are just adjacent to the lake. And so if you walk down the lake bund, you will see these gardens a little further up, which is exactly where we find the rose garden today as well, which is why I've used it as an entry point for this section. Hyder Ali was commander-in-chief of the early Wadiyars. And before he actually took over from the Wadiyars themselves, he played a significant part in deterring the Marathas, who kept repeatedly attacking Mysore and Bangalore and this part of India. And he did that successfully. In fact, the Marathas are also thought to have ransacked Sringeri. And because of the success that he had in deterring the Marathas, the Wadiyars gifted him land, which included Bangalore, or certainly this part of Bangalore. And Hyder Ali, being a devout Muslim, and like many other Muslims, believed that a garden is a reflection of paradise on earth. At least this seems to be more of a Persian philosophy. I don't know if it is true in all branches of Islam, so because of that, they had this tradition of building lots of gardens, and the kind of gardens that the Mughals built were again inspired by the Persian gardens that are called the Char Bagh. And you will see an example of a Char Bagh here, which is Jahangir's tomb in Lahore. And many of the gardens that we are familiar with, whether it's in Agra, even the Brindavan gardens, follow this kind of an design. And Hyder Ali's so Hyder Ali built 3 gardens, one in Srirangapatna, one in Malavalli, I think, and the other in Bangalore. And these gardens, at least for the Bangalore garden, the more immediate influence is a garden that the Mughals controlled in Sira, which is not too far away from Bangalore. Now, during my conversation with Venkat, he mentioned to me about the Tegalas. And I was a little ashamed that being a Bangalorean, I hadn't heard of the Tegalas, but I had heard of another word that we use for them, which is the Vanyakula Kshatriyas. And these are people who Hyder Ali convinced. Maybe there were people who had already moved to Bangalore, but Hyder Ali convinced a lot of them to move to Bangalore and help in his gardens because they were horticultural workers. And many of them settled down in and around Lal Bagh, and they worked in the gardens of Hyder Ali and eventually Tipu Sultan. And they continue to do that to this day. And they're not only employees, many of them are not only employees, Lal Bagh, but they also work in nurseries around Lal Bagh. And the Vanyakula Kshatriyas, when Kempegowda built these, made these thotas, and he also established, presumably would have established paddy fields, etc., around the Pete area. Needed water for irrigation. Bangalore is not a river-fed city. So he did construct a few tanks. The most prominent among them is the Dharmambudi tank and the Kempambudi tank. The former is now the Majestic bus stand, the central bus terminus, and the latter is a small puddle, apparently, somewhere near Bull Temple. And Kempegowda's son constructed more such tanks, one of which is the Sampangi tank, which is now taken over by the Kantirava Stadium, as well as the St. Joseph's, I think the grounds of the St. Joseph's Indian High School. Now, the Tiglas, they have a annual festival in Bangalore as well as in other places, but the Bangalore one is very prominent. Thousands of them gather during the what is known as the Karaga festival, and they go to different sacred places which are near these lakes. Even if these lakes don't exist, often the temples near these lakes will exist, or there will be some sacred tree or something like that. And they will go to each of these places and offer worship. So one of the things that one could potentially do is tell the story from the perspective of the Tiglas. And this is something that I would like to explore, and if possible, actually go and meet some of them. Now, Hyder Ali's inspiration for constructing this garden seems to have been mostly religious. Tipu Sultan's might have also been religious, but Tipu Sultan was crazy about plants. And I had a look at a list of books in his library, and these books are in Persian, in Arabic, Kannada, Tulu, French, of course. And many of these books have to do with plants, including medicinal plants and natural history. And Tipu Sultan went in his short life, right? And most of his time would have been spent fighting battles. In a short life, he did quite a few things. And one of the things that he did was building on this garden that his father had set up. So this particular image is this particular painting is a Cheluvaya Raju painting, which is of a sausage tree, which is originally from Mozambique. And Tipu Sultan got plants from all over. Of course, mangoes were some of his favorites, and he grew many different varieties of mangoes. This particular tree is a dead tree that has been converted into a sculpture. And if you look closer, it says it is about 250 years old, around the time when Tipu Sultan actually built on this, on his father's garden. This is another tree which says it's about 200 years old. I don't know how accurate these evaluations are, but this is a eucalyptus tree which did not exist in India back then. It is not clear how he got an eucalyptus tree. So many of the plants that Tipu Sultan got were from other Muslim countries and from the French and the French colonies, like Mozambique, which was at that point controlled by the French. And that's the sausage tree, which is not very uncommon in Bangalore today. But he also ended up getting plants from places like Australia, even though Australia would have just been born or was about to be established. I think it was the 1790s, early 1790s when Australia became a country. So it's not clear how he got these eucalyptus trees, but he did get them, and he planted many of these eucalyptus trees in Lal Bagh, as well as in a summer palace. Now, one other thing that Tipu Sultan did is that he indulged in something that Suresh Jairam refers to as botanical diplomacy. So he knew that India had a monopoly on at least some of the spices, and therefore he used it to his diplomatic advantage: cardamom and cinnamon and so on, pepper. And he would use this as leverage to obtain a lot of plants from many of the European countries. And he also got pines and oaks from the Cape of Good Hope, as well as many from the French colonies. And in fact, at one point, he sent an envoy, whose name I'm not able to recollect, to France to collect a bunch of plants as part of his diplomacy. And when this envoy came back, he was not happy with the work that was done, and he had him executed. It's not entirely clear if that was the only reason as to why he was executed, but that's the story that Suresh Jairam narrates. So Tipu Sultan was the first to actually, okay, this is the pepper plant. Tipu Sultan was the first to, quote unquote, nationalize 2 or 3 plants: the pepper, tobacco, and sandalwood. When I say nationalized, what I'm saying is that these plants can only be grown by the state. Or if you do happen to have them, it doesn't belong to you. And this is something that continues even today as far as sandalwood is concerned. Now, after the death of, the English came here in the 1790s, and developing Lal Bagh was not a priority. They needed to first defeat Tipu Sultan, which they did in the late 1700s. And once they did, they started focusing their attention on this lovely garden that both Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali had set up. And this is the breadfruit. I'll talk about it in just a second. So there are a bunch of people who came here and who played a part in developing what we refer to as Lal Bagh today. By the way, it wasn't called Lal Bagh until the 1850s. They just called it Hyder Ali's garden or Tipu Sultan's garden. And the first person of note for us is a German missionary called Benjamin Hein. And Benjamin Hein was, am I moving too far away from the camera? Benjamin Hein was a missionary who worked in Tranquebar. And after that, he moved to Samalkot. Vijay Thiruvadi does a really good job of describing, providing a biographical account of all of these European botanists who are associated with Lal Bagh. And he also traces the academic ancestry of Benjamin Hein. And Benjamin Hein, so you can trace it back to Linnaeus. Benjamin Hein then went to Samalkot, which I think is a place that's not too far, that's in Kakinada. There was a botanical garden there. And the British eventually abandoned that garden, presumably because they had a very similar garden in Calcutta, and the weather conditions were also very similar. And so after being in Samalkot which is where his mentor, Roxburgh, worked. And he comes back to Bangalore, and the breadfruit was growing in Samalkot. So it's very likely that the breadfruit tree was brought to Bangalore from this place, but it originally came from the Andamans. Now, there are two other interesting projects that Benjamin Hein undertook. One was growing potatoes, and he grew potatoes in Lal Bagh as well as in Nandi Hills and Savandurga. And these potatoes were so popular, apparently, that the locals would start selling it to others, consuming it and then selling it to others. And this variety of potato is the variety of potato that is the ancestor of all the potatoes that we consume today. It's very closely related to the potatoes that we consume today. These potatoes that Benjamin Hein planted were shipped all across the country, and they found that these potatoes grew pretty well throughout the country. The other project that he undertook was, he did lots of things. He was also a surveyor, as you can tell from this slide. The other project that he undertook was growing, different people pronounce it differently, cinchona or cinchona. And this is a South American plant that's grown in the Andes. And many of you will be familiar with this plant as the plant that is used to treat malaria, right? And the British, of course, consumed it in a slightly different way, which is in tonic and gin. Once Benjamin Hein fell sick and he wanted to go back to Tranquebar and maybe even Germany, but I think he went back to Tranquebar and maybe Southeast Asia. The person who came and looked after Lal Bagh after him was a military person called Gilbert Waugh. Now, Gilbert Waugh was not a botanist. He did some experiments with plants, but he spent most of his time growing sugarcane and as well as some fruiting trees. Sugarcane as well as coffee. And these are things that he did in Mysore, and he continued doing this in Lal Bagh. So that's what he's known for. In the 1830s, another interesting botanist who was also in the military, and many of these people who were botanists back then were either missionaries or doctors, sometimes both, because those two professions are often intertwined. And many of them are also, the other thing that you'll notice that many of these people are Scottish. So the other person that we need to know is William Munro, who was one of those Scottish doctors. And he was an expert on grasses. So he worked on grasses, including cereals like oats, barley, and hops. And he also set up the Bangalore chapter of the Agri-Horticultural Society, which still exists in Calcutta, I believe. Then Lal Bagh was sort of led to, was in a state of mismanagement for a few years after that. And in the 1850s, something changed. And what that was, I'll tell you in just a minute. But once this happened, you had the birth of modern Lal Bagh. And here is a magnolia. And they started planting a lot of these ornamental and flowering trees, but they also made a horticultural garden. And so for the first time, you see both a horticultural garden as well as a botanic garden, as they call it, or botanical garden. In the late first I'll talk about this. This is the bandstand, which unfortunately in the last few years has been dismantled. I believe that Intac is working on restoring this, but so you can see that the British now were driven by A, making it a sort of center for botanical research, and B, a center for horticulture, and C, it's also a place where it's also a place for recreation, like this bandstand. I believe, as I said, Intac is working on restoring this. In the 1870s, they also built the structure that all of you will be familiar with if you know Lal Bagh, which is the glass house. I think late 1870s, and it was called the Albert Victor Conservatory. So in England, they had a big exhibition in 1851, for which they built this gigantic structure called the Crystal Palace. And the Crystal Palace, the design of the Crystal Palace was based on this. Some of you may have seen this picture of this big lily pad called, I think Victoria Amazonia is the scientific name. People can actually stand on that. It's floating on water and you can actually stand on that because it has a network. If you look on the underside of it, it has a network of ribs that's filled with pockets of air. I don't understand the physics of it completely, but it supports a lot of weight, even though you have these very, very small ribs or veins. And the design of the Crystal Palace was based on this lily pad. And this allowed them to build a huge glass structure. How much time can I take, Venkat? 10 minutes? Okay. This huge, sorry, not this, another huge glass structure that was supported by very thin columns of cast iron. And this was built for this particular exhibition in Hyde Park and eventually moved to South London. But unfortunately, it succumbed to a fire in the 1930s. And it lends its name to a place around it, I think, called Crystal Palace. There's also a Crystal Palace Football Club. So this person, Hugh Cleghorn, who I'll talk about in just a second, happened to go to that exhibition and he was inspired by this design. And he comes back to Bangalore and he tries to convince first the Governor General and eventually the Maharaja of Mysore to construct a conservatory on the lines of the Crystal Palace, which eventually materialized in the 1870s, late 1870s. During this time, they also decided to introduce many animals in Lal Bagh. This is what is known as the dovecot, and where many pigeons live, but they had all sorts of birds back in the day. And they also had a separate aviary. And this is the deer pen, where you have lots of, had lots of deer. And the kinds of animals that existed in the mid 1850s in Lal Bagh is quite astounding. They had tigers, they had hyenas, they had an orangutan, And there's also a story. I looked at a dissertation of a PhD or a master's student from Bangalore University. He was a history student, and he talks about a bear mauling a woman, and they had to pay her a compensation of 150 rupees back in the day. And so they had lots of animals. And this was not an uncommon thing to do in a botanic garden. It also would get people interested in the park. So Lal Bagh, unlike Kavan Park, has always been a walled park. And so they would allow local, remember, now this is not in the cantonment area. It's far away from the cantonment, right? But the British, by and large, controlled Lal Bagh. And they would work really hard to make sure that people did visit this park and go tell other people, because it was part of their enlightenment project to, quote unquote, civilize the locals. But at the same time, they ensured that there was some kind of regulation on who entered the park. So it was after, in the 1850s and after the 1850s, until the well into the 1900s, that you had that you had an agenda for Lal Bagh, which was based on making sure that this is the heart of botanical exploration, at least in this part of India, although Ooty and Madras also had their botanical gardens. But this was a place where they actually did science. Modern botany was born with Benjamin Hine, but it flourished after the 1850s. This was also the place where they tried to ensure that you had recreation. It was also the horticultural center where they grew lots of fruits and vegetables. And the person I'm pretty sure that this building was a restaurant called Davinia back in the day. It no longer exists, certainly doesn't exist as a restaurant. The person who was largely responsible for this change is a guy called Hugh Cleghorn. And Hugh Cleghorn was, again, a very devout Scottish surgeon. And he was appointed as the advisor. So the one person who took interest in Lal Bagh was the governor of Madras, who was Edward Clive, the son of Robert Clive. And he suggested to Richard Wellesley, the brother of Arthur Wellesley, who defeated Tipu Sultan and who went on to fight Napoleon and become the British Prime Minister, etc. So he suggested to Wellesley that Cleghorn would be a good person to appoint as an advisor. And so Cleghorn was, along with, and Mark Cubbon was then the commissioner of Mysore. And with another person called Andrew Jaffrey, they were looking for a place for a horticultural garden. That's how this whole scheme developed. And as they were doing that, they realized that Hyder Ali's gardens, which already existed, could be repurposed, which is what they ended up doing. There were several people who they appointed as superintendents. So you had superintendents starting with a guy called William New in the 1850s. And you had another person called Black, but he died and then William New came back. But the most important person, and if you had to say that the person who can be credited for the establishment of modern Lal Bagh, that would be John Cameron. And he's immortalized by a gate that is named after him, the main gate. And John Cameron was the person who was responsible for expanding the garden and making sure that all of these projects that the British had in mind came to fruition. He was followed by a German who was also trained in Kew Gardens. Now, from the 1850s onwards until the 1970s, all the people who were in charge of Lal Bagh were trained at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. And so was Krumbiegel, who was a German. And Krumbiegel was working in Baroda, and then he was the Mysore Maharaja convinced him to come to Bangalore, and he became in charge. He was in charge of several things, but he was also in charge of Lal Bagh. Now, his main he was a town planner. So his attention was more on landscaping and also constructing many buildings. So some of the buildings that you see in Lal Bagh today were built during Krumbigel's time. I won't spend too much time talking about these. The next person so Krumbigel's assistant was this person called Javaraya, who was also trained at Kew Gardens. And Javaraya spent about 12 years as the superintendent of Lal Bagh, but of those 12 years, 5 or 6 years were spent in Delhi, where he was sent on deputation. And his main contribution was he set up many farms outside of Lal Bagh, sort of mini Lal Baghs. There were not too many of these. The big, the large scale adoption of these kinds of mini Lal Baghs around the state was conducted by Murray Gowda, who followed him, who was also trained at Kew Gardens. In this picture, you can see one of the things that he's really well known for is traveling around the country and ensuring that not just fruits and vegetables are grown, but also focusing on the logistics of transportation and making sure that they get from one place to another. And Javaraya was sent to Delhi on deputation, as I told you. The flower show in Bangalore in Lal Bagh Gardens is extremely popular. And the flower show was taken by Javaraya to Delhi. And according to Tiruvedi, the flower show was so popular, the Delhi flower show was so popular that people would compare it to the well-known Chelsea flower show. Murray Gowda, who followed him immediately after independence, he finished his PhD and then was sent to Kew Gardens for about a year for training. And his claim to fame, as I mentioned, was trying to recreate mini Lal Baghs around the state. So today in Karnataka, we have almost every taluka has horticultural gardens where fruits and vegetables are grown, thanks to Murray Gowda. Today, Lal Bagh is a public park. It's no longer a botanical garden. And it's not registered as a botanical garden. We have the flower show. The glass house is not used as a conservatory by and large. You have the flower show twice a year. And you have many other things that people come to see, including this clock. A few years ago, they tried to introduce tickets to get into Lal Bagh, and they also wanted to make sure that only people with IDs, valid IDs, can enter Lal Bagh. There was a big hue and cry. And once what happened was that once this because of the kind of noise that people were making, they did not like the fact that local Bangaloreans were being charged money to get into Lal Bagh. They arrived at a compromise where they decided that people who come before 9 o'clock for a morning walk can come in for free, but they were very keen on making sure that they get their ticket money. I think it's about 50 rupees. But nevertheless, that's a lot of revenue. And the few people that I spoke to all insist that while in one way, the decay of Lal Bagh is good because we have created many different Lal Baghs around the state for horticulture. That's really good. But they bemoan people who know Lal Bagh, including Mr. Narayan Swamy, who's a curator and who was also a historian of Lal Bagh. They feel that Lal Bagh, we should try to make sure that Lal Bagh regains its formal glory as a botanical garden, even though it is called a botanical garden. It is not a botanical garden. There is no education form. There is no, we do not, I mean, there are people who come on tours, but there is no imparting of education, botanical education by the horticultural department. There is no herbarium collection. There are no research projects that are carried out in Lal Bagh today. Bird watchers. So lots of people use Lal Bagh for many different things. So I think this is a good point for us to pause and think about what we want Lal Bagh to become. Lal Bagh is, if I'm not mistaken, about 200 acres in size, which is pretty decent for for any kind of botanical garden. I haven't had a chance to go to Kew Gardens, but I've been to the Missouri Botanical Garden, which is, I think, half the size of Lal Bagh. So there is no reason for us not to think about the possibility of having some sort of hybrid model where we set aside part of Lal Bagh for anybody to come and visit, and it serves the purpose of a public park because we don't have such spaces in the city. We don't have too many such spaces in the city. And you could also have gardens where you can have potentially guided tours, and you can have certain sections that are set aside only for research and researchers. And this is something that we need to think about in the space which we have already modified so much. There's no reason why we cannot think about it to ensure that it regains its former glory. And I wouldn't be surprised if the people in charge, the establishment, will not be open to the idea of maybe making sure that Lal Bagh is able to achieve both of these goals. I will stop talking here. And if you have any, I know that we are at least 15 minutes beyond the scheduled time. So I will not say more at this point, but if you have any questions or suggestions, please, I don't know if you have time now, but please feel free to come and talk to me or to Sadhana, especially if it is about the museum project that we are involved in. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karthik. Just in the interest of time, we'll keep it to maybe 2 questions here, and then we'll continue this in refreshments outside.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. And it felt that we've come across various eras in time and now come back to the current. So I had a few questions, but I will just wrap it up. That existence of animals, when did that start disappearing? And I assume that they were out in the open, not like a zoo or enclosure.
So they did have a menagerie. So it was in some instances it was sort of like a zoo, and there were enclosures.
Yeah.
So I did read somewhere that 1830s was the first time they started introducing the animals, but it was really something that happened during the time of William New, I think, who was one of the first Kew alumni who worked at Lal Bagh. And again, it saw a decline in the 1890s when Bangalore was struck by a plague, and Krumbiegel was responsible for getting in more animals. But this was not something that people worried about too much in later years.
Yeah, I'll pass the mic on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm a landscape architect, and I have great interest in gardens, as would be expected. My question is that, it's not a question, but I want to ask whether there are any, whether you follow the documentation of how it evolved. So in plan, so if you have that, then that would also throw a lot of light into how and what the priorities were and what the accent was, because to most of us, it is an arboretum. I mean, there are plants from all over the world, and yes, there is no research happening. But when I started out, I went and had a look to identify plants. So now I want to know whether there is that evolution of the plan that you can lay your hands on.
So one is, of course, the evolution of Lal Bagh in terms of how much area it occupies. It began as 40 acres or so, and then it became 50 acres, and then 100 acres, and then during the time of Murray Gowda, it became even bigger. We have a good sense of all the things that we did. So there are certain times when we really don't know about what happened. Certainly between the time of we're not very good at keeping records. Certainly between the time of Kempe Gowda until Tipu Sultan, we don't really know as to what happened there. And it was only after the British came, but even after the British came, it was not a priority from the late 1700s. They did get some botanists because they were interested, and quite a few military people were interested in Lal Bagh. So we have some sketchy records until the 1850s, but after that, we have pretty solid records. I unfortunately have not had a chance to look at the primary records as yet, both in the Karnataka State Archives as well as in the Lal Bagh Library or the Horticultural Library. But based on writings and based on publications, we have a decent sense of when different plants were planted in Lal Bagh. It's a good question. I think that depends on how each one defines that glory. But Lal Bagh has been able to sustain most of the plants that were brought in from outside, as well as the native plants that were planted in Lal Bagh. Lal Bagh has been able to sustain most of it. And there is no reason for us. I mean, it's just that not many people are documenting what we have and what we may have lost. But I think we have a good number of plants. But if there's some botanist or somebody who knows Lal Bagh quite intimately, please do let us know.
Thanks, Karthik. Thanks.
One.
Okay, that has to be short because we are running out of time. Thanks.
It's a lively presentation. There is one Japanese what is it? Ravens, and there is no significant.
Yeah, this is something that seems to have happened in recent years. They have something called a Japanese garden or a bonsai garden. I really don't know why it was made, and I mean, this is so. There's no overriding philosophy of what Lal Bagh should be, and that was the point that I was trying to make.
Thank you. I'm sure we can continue this, Karthik, if it's okay. We'll continue this over tea and refreshments, but please do join me in thanking him for his talk again.